The unthinkable has happened. Vladimir Putin, Russia's ironclad ruler since the start of the century, has been overthrown in a sudden coup. The geopolitical landscape is about to undergo its most significant shift in decades as power brokers within the Kremlin scramble to fill the vacuum. Russia, and now the world, stand at a crossroads. The coup unfolded during what was supposed to be a routine security briefing at Putin's heavily fortified Novo-Ogaryovo residence outside of Moscow. In a stunning betrayal, senior members of his own security apparatus, once fiercely loyal, turned on him. Russian state media has gone eerily silent, cutting off live broadcasts and flooding the channels with Soviet-era documentaries. Meanwhile, Western intelligence sources suggest the operation was months in the making. Beyond anger over the disastrous war in Ukraine, insiders point to another destabilizing factor: growing doubts about Putin's health. Whispers of serious illness had been circulating amongst his closest allies and advisors for months, eroding confidence in his ability to lead. In a Kremlin culture where strength is survival, even a hint of weakness was enough to encourage the plots to remove him. Fueled by anger, fear, and opportunity, the long-standing cracks within Russia's ruling elite split wide open, plunging the nation into uncertainty. For the first time in decades, the Russian Federation teeters on the brink, and what comes next could reshape the world. The immediate fallout from Putin's overthrow is swift. Russia's stock market plummeted within minutes of the news breaking, while the ruble's value against the dollar fell to historic lows. Military units stationed near Moscow have reportedly been placed on high alert, with some intelligence sources indicating unusual troop movements near key government installations. Meanwhile, nuclear forces remain at a standard readiness level, with some officials suggesting that the uncertainty may kick off a nuclear war. Of course, none of this has actually happened. Putin remains firmly in power, at least for now. But recent events have fueled growing speculation about what might unfold if he were to leave office in the near future, whether through political pressure, internal revolt, or something even more dramatic. As Russia enters this period of unprecedented uncertainty, the question on everyone's mind is simple yet profound: who or what will rule Russia next? With Putin's dismissal, Russia's political landscape has been thrown into chaos. The constitutional mechanism for succession places Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin as acting president, but his grip on power is tenuous at best. Several factors make Mishustin an unlikely long-term successor. First, his role as acting president would only cover the period until the next election, and there's no guarantee that he would win that election outright. His relatively low-profile presence in Russian politics, combined with a more moderate stance on major issues like the war in Ukraine, sets him apart from more hardline figures. While this should make him a stronger candidate on paper, the rest of Russia's oligarchy and command might see it as a weakness and a step back from Putin's efforts. That leaves some of Putin's closest allies as the likeliest contenders, and one of the top names is Sergei Shoigu. As Russia's former defense minister, Sergei Shoigu was instrumental in launching the invasion of Ukraine. Despite the operation's obvious strategic failures and a growing list of military setbacks, Shoigu managed to hold on to his place within Putin's inner circle. He was moved to a new role as Secretary of the Security Council, essentially Putin's national security advisor. Shoigu's influence goes way back, even before Putin's rise to power. For 2 decades, from 1991 to 2012, he served as Minister of Emergency Situations, becoming one of the most visible faces in the government. He crisscrossed the country responding to natural disasters, earning public trust during a chaotic post-Soviet era. Shoigu's early efforts helped restore public faith in the government, laying the foundation for the state-driven propaganda machine that would later prop up Putin's rule. All Shoigu would have to do is follow the trail of breadcrumbs that he made for Putin and settle into the role. But while he is one of the likelier candidates to take the helm, several factors are working against him. For one, his handling of the Ukraine conflict has significantly damaged his reputation. What was supposed to be a very quick victory has turned into a protracted conflict with devastating losses. Recent estimates suggest Russian casualties may exceed 900,000 after 3 years of war, far more than previously acknowledged by the Kremlin. This is why Putin changed his role in the government. Even if the new position might sound like a promotion, Shoigu has largely left the media spotlight, with only sporadic public appearances and announcements. And then, there's the age factor. Shoigu is only slightly younger than Putin, which raises the obvious question: even if he steps into the presidency, how long would he last? Putin himself says that he wants a younger successor, someone who could hold on to power for the long haul, not just act as a placeholder. That same downside would follow Nikolai Patrushev. As the former head of the Russian spy agency FSB, former secretary of the Security Council, and Putin's direct aide, Patrushev's rise to power is strikingly similar to Putin's. With ties deep into Russian spy networks, Patrushev has the means and motive to direct Russia's politics to his goals. Through Patrushev's common history with Putin as part of the KGB, the pair are likely to have similar worldviews. In fact, Patrushev might have an even harder line, especially when it comes to Western efforts to curb Russian influence over former Soviet states. If he were to assume power, his presidency would likely echo the final years of Putin's rule, marked by confrontation, isolation, and deepening authoritarianism. In effect, Patrushev would be a direct successor to Putin, where nothing major would change. In recent years, Patrushev has played a pivotal role in Russian politics and diplomacy, particularly in managing relations with China, now one of Russia's most critical economic and political partners. As Western sanctions intensified following the invasion of Ukraine and continuing to escalate through 2023 and 24, Moscow leaned heavily onto Beijing. Patrushev was the one to facilitate this relationship, showing him to be one of the most trusted members of Putin's former entourage. Also, his ties to the military and spy network, as well as a favorable view of Russia's biggest trading partner, would mean that he would likely face minimal opposition from those quarters. But what about the age issue? Patrushev, like Shoigu, isn't exactly a long-term solution, but he might already have a successor in mind, his son, Dmitry. At 47, Dmitry Patrushev is much younger and already holds a significant role as Russia's Minister of Agriculture. He's also an FSB Academy graduate, which puts him firmly in the same power network as his father and Putin. And that is no coincidence. Nikolai once referred to the FSB as Russia's new nobility, and Dmitry fits that mold perfectly. A next-generation insider with the right connections and the right pedigree. His father's close ties to Putin could easily smooth his path to power. From a Western perspective, Dmitry might look like a less ominous option. He wouldn't likely dismantle the Kremlin's authoritarian structure, but he might be more pragmatic, less confrontational, more open to adjusting Russia's direction over time. In a best-case scenario, his leadership could ease tensions abroad and prevent Russia from collapsing under its own weight. But if the line of succession wishes to avoid that path, the presidency would also likely pass to someone else in Putin's inner circle who could maintain his confrontational stance toward the West. There are a few other possible options, starting with Alexei Dyumin, Putin's former bodyguard. The Dyumin first made headlines in 2016 when he claimed to have saved Putin from a brown bear attack. Whether or not that actually happened, the tale cemented his image as a fiercely loyal protector, someone who would guard Putin's legacy long after his presidency ended. That same year, Putin appointed Dyumin as the governor of Tula, a strategically important region just south of Moscow. Tula isn't just any province, it is a key buffer between Russia's heartland and the West. Dyumin had no ties to the area, which raised plenty of eyebrows, but that move wasn't random. Appointing loyalists as governors in regions far away from Moscow has been a hallmark of the Kremlin strategy. By planting trusted allies in powerful local positions, the Russian government has kept a tight grip on the country, shutting down any chances of regional independence. It's the same playbook that brought Putin to power. Back in 1999, he was a little-known politician until then-President Boris Yeltsin handpicked him as his successor. Dyumin's rise would fit that same mold: loyal, obscure, strategically placed, and a complete surprise. But another former Russian president could just make the cut: Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev's presidency from 2008 to 2012 wasn't so much a power grab as a placeholder. Putin, limited by the constitution at the time from serving 2 consecutive terms, handed the job to Medvedev, essentially keeping control from behind the curtain. After a single term, Putin came right back. Medvedev, for his part, didn't put up much of a fight. His term was low-key, maybe even deliberately passive and moderate, which fed the impression that he lacked real ambition without Putin pulling the strings. After stepping down, Medvedev stayed in the game, but not at the center. In 2020, his position shifted from prime minister to deputy chairman of the Security Council, technically under Putin, but ranked above Shoigu. The change came just before the Kremlin fell under pressure due to the Ukraine invasion, and it's when Medvedev's tone took a hard turn. The once mild-mannered, relatively pro-Western former president transformed into a loud, aggressive Putin loyalist. His rhetoric became harshly anti-West, full of nationalist statements and accusations. It was a clear signal he was all in on the Putin line, maybe as a way to reclaim relevance or position himself for another shot at the top job. Age-wise, Medvedev is 59, which makes him an appealing middle-ground candidate. He's not as old as Putin, but not a part of the up-and-coming next gen either. That puts him in a unique spot. He's someone who could extend Putin's glory for another 2 terms while paving the way for a younger successor. But what really sets Medvedev apart is his reputation, however faded, for moderation. His past as a more open, Western-friendly leader could be his biggest asset. If those views weren't entirely in act, he could be the West's best hope for hitting the reset button. If he's only posturing now to get Putin's approval, there's a possibility that he could pivot again to make him a surprisingly strategic option for both sides. Another prominent local figure who might step up is the mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin. While Sobyanin hasn't made headlines on his political opinions, Moscow has flourished as the country's population and economic center, holding a considerable amount of power over the entire federation and accounting for over 20% of the country's GDP. And it's Sobyanin who has managed to silently encourage those gains over the past 15 years in the role, or at least become the person credited for them. And this means that he had plenty of time to learn the inner workings of the Kremlin and could leverage his experience to propel Moscow forward as the nation's true center. Sobyanin was also previously head of the Kremlin administration between 2005 and 2008 and deputy prime minister from 2008 to 2010. Additionally, Sobyanin's term as Moscow's mayor has made him a popular and well-known figure in Russia's internal politics and its population. With Putin gone, Sobyanin could ride in on the coattails of this popularity to seize and hold on to power. But there's another person who might try to pursue the presidential role due to their long-standing prominent position in Russia's government: Sergei Kiriyenko. Similar to Mishustin, Kiriyenko belongs to the technocratic side of Russia's leading men. However, Kiriyenko has had decades to perfect his political stance and ideology. His first prominent role was that of prime minister in 1998 under Yeltsin, which also allowed him to propel Putin's own career forward by handing him the FSB leadership. Currently, as first deputy chief of staff, Kiriyenko enjoys significant influence over domestic policy and maintains regular access to Putin. This also gives him a vital role in overseeing the occupied territory in Ukraine, visiting towns to further boost his prominence in the country's politics. Kiriyenko's ascension wouldn't come without issues, though. His short term as prime minister was marred by one of the country's worst economic crises of that decade, and he was known as the liberal reformer. While most of his recent stance is that of a stern Putin loyalist, it's unclear how the rest of the cabinet would see this sudden switch. The people we mentioned before are possible successors only if there's an orderly transition of power or if the constitutional mechanisms function as intended. But with Putin's sudden removal, Russia might face a far more complex and unpredictable future. Rather than a clear succession, we might see an all-out struggle for power between the main political factions in Russia. By some counts, there are 6 main elite groups that will exert their influence over Russia in the post-Putin era. The first is the Silovikia, or strongmen, which have so far been largely responsible for putting Putin in the post and maintaining Russia's image as an imperialist nation. Some of Putin's potential successors belong to this group, including Patrushev, Kiriyenko, and Shoigu. On the whole, the Silovikia control the country's main military force, but not Russia's main economic input. If they fail to take over the country by brute force, they can hope to negotiate with another group to consolidate power. The second is the military-industrial complex, the producer of Russian arms and military equipment. Rostec, the country's main corporation that oversees armament production, also owns Novicom Bank. That means that the complex can also manage cash flow between the industries, bolstering its self-sufficiency. With the war in Ukraine having depleted much of Russia's military stockpiles, this group may have gained significant influence. 2 of the most influential groups are related to the gas extraction and processing industry. The 2 main players in that group are Gazprom and Novatek. Somewhat curiously, Gazprom also has its own military complement and a media service. That means that Gazprom could create effective propaganda and information campaigns while creating a stranglehold on Russian politics by controlling one of the country's main exports. This gas elite's counterpart is the oil extraction industry headed by Russia's Rosneft. While it lacks the same media and military clout as Gazprom, Rosneft plays a key role in Russia's energy landscape. Unlike the gas sector, it maintains deeper ties to Western markets, largely due to its competition with Middle Eastern oil, a major supplier to China. Another group that could hold significant sway over who could be the next Russian president is the Kovalchuk brothers, Yuri and Mikhail. Yuri Kovalchuk is the largest shareholder of the Rossiya Bank, which was elevated to one of the largest financial institutions in the country. The Kovalchuks are considered among Putin's closest friends and have significant stakes in all major state media. The current Prime Minister, Mishustin, is also believed to be heavily tied to the Kovalchuk conglomerate. Therefore, they could guide Russian citizens away from other prominent groups and back into Putin's ideology, regardless of who ends up in the president's seat. Russia could be ushered into a new age of autocratic technocracy with the help of Kiriyenko and Mishustin. This part of the elite has spearheaded efforts to promote skilled administrators via sponsored plans such as Leaders of Russia, Russia Land of Opportunities, and School of Governors. As a result, the elites coming out of these programs can assume vital governmental positions, so even if Kiriyenko doesn't directly succeed Putin, he might continue working behind the scenes. These 6 groups are unlikely to have common goals, and each one will try to take over the Russian administration for itself. In some cases, more forward-thinking groups like the technocrats might create a new Russian regime that's open to working alongside the West rather than against it. Others would perpetuate ideologies similar to Putin's, or even worse, plunging the country deeper into war and internal strife. In the worst-case scenario, depending on how you look at it, the Russian Federation could splinter off into its constituent republics. Russia has 21 republics, 46 oblasts, 3 major cities, 4 autonomous regions, and 9 krais. And any one of those could attempt to work alone and dismantle the Federation. While this separation could be unfathomable to some, it has happened twice before. In the 1910s during the collapse of the Russian Empire, and in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The shift may not be immediate or absolute, but the growing wave of protests that Putin was forced to suppress in recent years suggests a potential tipping point. Russian minorities might gain the courage to make their own moves alongside or opposing the elite. In this scenario, it's impossible to predict how the new countries will orient themselves to the rest of the world. It would certainly spell doom for the war in Ukraine, though. And with the authoritarian strongman now gone, there's also a possibility, however slim, that Russia could experience a democratic awakening. Alexei Navalny had long been the face of Russia's democratic movement, and at one point was even considered a top contender to succeed Vladimir Putin. But the movement suffered a devastating blow with Navalny's death in prison in February 2024. This coincided with the Russians' largely passive approach to the invasion of Ukraine. Russia's propaganda machine is working overtime to convince citizens that Ukraine has no chance of repelling the invasion. In fact, in the face of that narrative, public apathy may ultimately reduce Navalny's legacy to collateral damage in the Kremlin's effort to pacify the nation. That doesn't mean that democracy might not just win out, however. Unrest has been brewing in Russia for years. Moscow only has become the hub of pro-Putin activity due to its relative distance from the front. Still, close to 1 million middle-class Russians fled the country to avoid being drafted. With the war in Ukraine bringing about a larger need for manpower, this concentrated power might lose out amidst staggering demographic and unemployment issues throughout the country. This could push Moscow's elite to recognize the war is no longer just a distant issue, it is hitting them personally, and it might just create the very conditions that triggered Putin's overthrow in the first place. However, even if the coup leads to democratic efforts, this Russia might not be all that different from the one heralded by Putin. It would fall to the new government to dismantle Putin's Siloviki power structure and build a leadership capable of fostering stable, cooperative relations with the West, one that finally puts an end to Russia's imperialist ambitions. Considering just how deep the Kremlin's propaganda has seeped into the population, this would be a monumental effort. The new U.S. administration has somewhat undermined the potential for a more democratic approach. Meanwhile, the European part of NATO could require a complete overhaul of Russia's democratic government to usher in a post-Putin era. Putin's overthrow offers a fascinating lens through which to explore Russia's future leadership, but how likely is such a scenario? In reality, Putin's position, while far from unassailable, has been remarkably resilient despite mounting challenges. The war in Ukraine has been the most significant challenge to his reign. What was intended to be a swift conquest has devolved into a grinding conflict, with mounting Russian casualties, equipment losses, and territorial setbacks. These military disappointments have been compounded by Russia's increasing international isolation. Western sanctions have continued to tighten, cutting Russia off from crucial technologies and financial markets. Meanwhile, Russia has grown increasingly dependent on China, both as an economic partner and geopolitical ally. It's a relationship that some Russian elites might view with discomfort, fearing that Russia is becoming a junior partner to Beijing. Internal pressures have also mounted. The Wagner Group mutiny in 2023, though short-lived, represented the most serious challenge to Putin's authority in years. The subsequent death of Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin in a suspicious plane crash restored Putin's monopoly on military power. But it also demonstrated the lengths to which he might go to eliminate threats, potentially making other elites more nervous about their own security. If a credible coup were to materialize, it would likely come from within Putin's own security detail or inner circle, someone with both access and the protection of powerful backers. The motive would likely be to reorient Russia to a more moderate stance with the West, particularly the United States, in hopes of easing sanctions and ending the draining conflict in Ukraine. Such a move would be a calculated gamble, a bet that the West would be willing to engage with a post-Putin Russia and offer economic incentives in exchange for a meaningful shift in foreign policy. However, the uncertain aftermath of such an action serves as a powerful deterrent to those who might otherwise be tempted to move against him. It wouldn't be the first time people tried to take him out, and some attempts are pretty wild. Watch insane ways Vladimir Putin survived assassination attempts to see how close they actually got. or watch this video instead.